Hello, everyone. We are back. We are recording, and I'm going to hand it over to Jarl Crocker to get us started today.
Hi, and thank you, Cash. And again, this is Jarl Crocker. I'm Director of Training and Technical Assistance here at the Community Action Partnership. And thanks to all of you for joining us this morning and this afternoon, depending on where you are around the country. Before I turn it over to Emily, I just wanted to briefly review the purpose of this webinar. We had gotten a lot of feedback from our membership that the comprehensive risk assessment that we have online through the Nonprofit Risk Management Center is very helpful, but it is very long, requires a fair amount of prep work and also multiple folks answering questions. And so there have been some issues about and some requests about whether we could have some support, this webinar being that, to help agencies get prepared to go through that comprehensive risk assessment process. So ideally, between now and the 13th, if your agency has not gone through the risk assessment process, you should complete that process, and Cashin will talk to you at the end about how to get us feedback. But the purpose of that webinar on the 13th is to answer any questions you have, any follow-up questions about completing the online risk assessment, and also any questions about addressing issues that came up as you went through that risk assessment process. So on the 13th, we'll answer any questions again about completing the risk assessment and how to address the issues that the risk assessment might have flagged as you went through that process. So thank you all again very much for joining us. Make sure you stay with us at the end so Cashin can provide you the contact email to send in your additional questions or things that you'd like addressed in that second webinar. And I will now turn it over to Emily from the Nonprofit Risk Management Center. Take it away, Emily.
Hello, good afternoon, everyone. So my name is Emily Stumhofer, and I'm a staff attorney and a project manager at the Nonprofit Risk Management Center. And today I'm going to be talking about, like Jarl said, some of the basics about the risk assessment tool that you guys have online. And like Cashin said, if you have any questions throughout this presentation, please feel free to just type it into the box in the corner, and either she or I will help you with your question, and if possible, I'll address it during this presentation. So the Nonprofit Risk Management Center, a little about us. We're a small nonprofit ourselves. We do consulting. We created the risk assessment tool for CAP in 2013 in response to a need that was identified by management there. So that was the background of the tool. A brief overview of what I'm going to speak about today. First, I'm going to talk a little bit about risk management basics and risk generally. Then I'm going to talk specifically about the tool and kind of the purpose behind its creation and some different aspects generally of it. The third part of the process of this presentation, and the longest by far, will be the modules. So I'm going to go through each of those in detail and talk a little about the different information that's requested, what kinds of things should be thought about prior to sitting down to complete those modules. And then finally, I'm going to talk about a few general tips and takeaways that will help you with the process if you haven't already gone through it. So first, risk management basics. So what is risk? This is one of our favorite definitions at the center, and it's our favorite for a few reasons. It defines risk as an action or event, so it's something that's concrete and could potentially happen in the future. It also could be positive or negative, so adversely or beneficially influence your organization's ability. And then the third part here is that it affects what you can do in the future to achieve your objectives. So those are all really important aspects of how we view risk here at the center, and this tool was meant to help you guys identify risks and deal with them in these three different components. So of course there are other definitions, and this is another that some people really like as well. And it's kind of planning for contingent futures, the idea that something that happens in the future may be very different from what you expect. So having a plan to deal with that if that's the case. So what is risk management? Risk management is what I do every day, and it's a discipline for dealing with uncertainty. It was developed to help organizations kind of deal with different future contingencies that they might not fully understand, and to help them make plans to deal with things that may happen in the future. Last year at the center, we did a risk readiness survey, and we asked people what risk management meant to them, and we got a lot of really interesting feedback, and these are some of the answers we got, and you can see that they're very diverse. So risk management isn't necessarily one specific thing. Some people think of it as proactively identifying risks that may come about in the future and thinking about ways to take steps to either minimize or mitigate the negative consequences of those risks. Some people think about risk management as helping an organization to really figure out what an appropriate level of risk for their specific mission is. So these are just some different ways to think about risk management and the purpose of going through something like this risk assessment tool. So here we have different aspects of risk management, and the 3 words along the top of this graphic here are things that are typically done early in the process. The 3 words along the bottom are typically decisions that are made by an organization about what to do about the risks that were identified, assessed, and analyzed. So obviously we're talking today specifically about the risk assessment. So a risk assessment is kind of a way to walk through your organization from a high level and look down on the different pieces of the organization, the operational risks, the governance risks, a bunch of different areas of risk, and a bunch of different areas of programmatic things that you're doing. So once you go through an assessment, it will help you identify these different risks and kind of group them into different areas. And then from there, you can also take that information and analyze specifically what types of risks are really important in your organization and what's really challenging your ability to achieve your objectives. And then along the bottom here, these are decisions that are usually made by management in an organization about what to do about those risks. So sometimes you may have risks that you want to reduce. You don't want them to happen if they're a really negative risk or they could potentially cause big problems in your mission work. You may want to transfer the risk, which is often done through insurance, or you may want to try to control it, so have some influence over it by changing what you're doing currently. So what is the purpose of risk management? Well, there are many different purposes, and it really depends on the organization. There are many different reasons that organizations may choose to put together a strong risk management program. So one major reason that we hear a lot is to gain more perspective. So an organization may feel that they don't have a complete view of the organization, and the reason this beach ball is on this page is this is an example we frequently use. You may be looking at only one piece of the beach ball. You may not be seeing all of your risks because you don't have the ability to see 360 in your organization. So going through a process like this will help you gain perspective about different risks in different areas of your organization. Another really common theme that we hear is preparing for the future. So you want to think about the different things that could happen in the future and prepare as best you possibly can for those different contingencies. So sometimes this is done by using scenario planning or kind of trying to think creatively about what types of things could happen in the future. And then finally, and possibly the most important purpose of risk management is to maintain the confidence, to build and maintain the confidence of your stakeholders. And this is especially important not only for external stakeholders such as donors and clients, but also for internal stakeholders. So a lot of organizations, after we've done work with them on their risk management program, we really feel that we have a better grasp on what we're doing day to day, and we really feel that some of our fears have been put to rest because we feel that we're doing as much as we possibly can to take care of these risks on a daily basis. All right, so the second section, I'm going to talk about specifically the risk assessment tool. This is kind of a general overview before I get into the details of the different modules. So the risk assessment tool is on our server, and it can be accessed at nonprofitrisk.org/cap. And on this page, you can either register or log in. Most of you are probably familiar with this and have been to this page previously. So you guys actually have two tools on this portal. One is the policies tool, where you can create policies for your organization. And then the other, and the one that is the focus of this presentation, is the assessment tool. So once you click on assessment, it brings you into an internal page here, and this is what you'll see. And as you can see here, there's frequently asked questions, there's some resources on this page, and then you can go directly into the assessment from this page. So once you're in the assessment, you'll see a list of all the different modules that are covered in the risk assessment for CAP. So there are 10 different modules here, and as you can see, I've completed most of them in this screenshot that I'm showing. But you can also review the answers that you've provided to a module, and you can also restart it at any time. Also, when you're going through the process, you can take a break at any time, and it will save your place. You can go back to it at a later point if necessary. So the purpose of the risk assessment tool generally, these were some of the thoughts when it was created at first. These are some of the goals of management. So the first was to engage staff. So we wanted to really bring everyone in an organization into this process to help people really think about what risks were really pertinent for them and identify those and then manage them as best they could within the organization. Second, we wanted to provide strategies for managing those risks. So the risk assessment tool gives you some feedback as you go along. As you're answering the questions, you get feedback, and in the final report at the end, you should also get feedback about some of the answers you've responded to. So this should help you develop a deeper understanding of risk management and help you in your later analysis process and then determining what to do finally about these risks at the end of the day. And then finally, obviously, the deliverable that you get at the end is this comprehensive report that has all the specific advice for these different areas in the module that you've answered. So that was the purpose. So initiating the process. So sometimes one person will be responsible for the assessment, and it was created so that one person could potentially walk through it. But if one person's going to walk through it, these are the characteristics that they would typically need to have. A very deep knowledge of the organization, some information about the history, and some specific knowledge in these areas, particularly governance, programs, staffing, and financial record keeping. So in a lot of organizations, no one person has all that knowledge. So it may be necessary to bring in more than one person or to create a team that goes through the risk assessment or takes turns in different modules so that you're getting all the information that's really necessary to build a complete and comprehensive kind of view of your organization's risks. So even when this is the case and you're building a team, typically you may want to have one person who's in charge of kind of bringing this team together and making sure that the assessment is actually finished at some point. And then that person can be accountable to making sure that the risk assessment is actually complete at the end of the day. So how many people do you need to involve? Well, it really depends on the organization structure. So in some organizations, there may be one person that has way more knowledge about the organization than anyone else. So that would probably be the person that you want to go to, or put that person in charge of actually making sure that everybody who you need to have give input does give input. And then otherwise, this presentation today should help you kind of figure out how many people you might need to involve and what types of knowledge are going to be really relevant for this. And that should be thought about probably before you begin the process, so you can go through it as fluidly as possible and have it finished as quickly as you can. So as Jarl said at the beginning, the risk assessment is very long. It's 10 modules. It covers several different areas of the organization's everyday operations, as well as governance and HR. It covers a lot. So the questions throughout regard current practices, different exposures to risk. They ask about what you're doing already and what you aren't doing. And there are actually over 400 screens in this assessment, so it can take quite some time to get through. So at the beginning of each module, there are several screens that provide some background information about the specific subject that's being covered in that module. And most of them don't ask really specific questions about documents, but there are a few modules that do. So I'm going to point those out, and there'll be a summary at the very end of this presentation that will give you kind of where you might really need to have specific documents with you and where you might need to look for that type of information. All right, so now we're at section 3. This is the bulk of the presentation, and we're going to go through each of the modules individually. We're going to talk about some of the specific questions that are covered in each of the modules and talk a little about the type of knowledge and the people you might want to include in those modules. So the first module is Introduction to Risk Management. It's 23 screens, so it's one of the shorter modules. Some of the topics include our basics of risk management, so similar to what we talked about at the beginning of this presentation. And it also asks some pretty general questions about how your risk management is set up in your organization. It asks a little bit about insurance practices, and it asks some questions about past threats of violence and other workplace safety. So some examples of the questions that you'll find in this module are on this page. So these questions aren't necessarily word for word from the risk assessment, but they're the same general question. So this is what you can expect to find in this very first module. Some necessary information to complete this module. You'll need to have some general information about the risk management process at your action agency. You'll also need to know a little bit about how much your board likes to be involved in risk management. It will also ask some brief questions about your insurance program generally and how long you've had a relationship with your current insurance advisor. So who you might want to involve here. You may want to involve someone who manages risk at your organization. This may be a standalone position, or it may be something that's done by an insurance manager as well. So these aren't necessarily positions at every organization, but these are like general information about the type of person that you might want to involve. You may not have all these people, and these people might not all need to be involved, but based on the questions in this module, these are the things that might really come up, and these people might really have the knowledge that you need. So the second module is on governance, and it's also a pretty short module. It's about 28 screens long. It asks a lot of questions about the board and how they're involved in your organization, what types of knowledge people on the board have, what types of expertise they have, and how much of a role they play in operations and finances. So some of the questions in here include things about whether the minutes reflect dissenting views and votes, and then whether you have a conflict of interest policy for your board, and then experience that your board members may have. So necessary documents, you may want to get an example of board minutes. For something like this, you probably want to have someone who either attends board meetings or has a lot of information specifically about the board and knows a lot about board policies, board orientation, is familiar with the bylaws, and has just generally a lot of knowledge about the board structure and whether there are committees and how it's governed. So this is very specific information that not everyone in your organization may have. And so some people that you may want to get involved here are your executive director, because typically they'll be at every board meeting. Or if you have specific staff that are liaisons to the board, those people may want to be also involved in this process. Or you may even want to ask a board member to help with this particular module. So we got a question about whether the module references the tripartite board requirements. And there is a question about whether your board falls under that, or whether your organization has that requirement because they're CSBG governed. So there is a question that gives a little background on that specifically and then asks the question about that. So that would be reflected in your report if that applies to your organization. We have another question about whether you can download a PDF of the questions in the modules prior to going through. I'm not sure if that's possible. I can double check on that. As far as I know, you can go through the process. You can probably print page by page, and at the end you can definitely print the report with all your answers. Once you've already been through the process, you can also print a if you're in that first page that gives you the options of resume, restart, or review. If you go to the review, it will give you a page that gives you kind of a brief version of each of the questions you've answered as well as your answer. So you could print that out and see what you've answered. As you're going through the process, you have to answer each question as you go along. So what we typically would recommend is that you answer the question to the best of your ability, and then you make a note of what that question was that you weren't completely sure about or that you need to come back to, and then come back to that. And an easy way to come back to that, instead of just going through the entire module again, which is what will happen if you push restart, if you simply click on the review, like I said, it gives you a short version of the question and the answer all in one page. You can change your answer there as well. So that's what we would recommend if you have a question that you're not completely sure about and you'd like to come back to it. That would be the best way to do that.
Hi, Emily. Sorry to interrupt. This is Cash, and I did want to add one piece to that. There isn't truly a kind of that full PDF per se, because it is a fairly smart system. That is why it's built completely online. So if, for example, you say that at the beginning of the module for transportation that you don't provide transportation for children or the elderly or something like that, it won't ask you any more of those questions. So if you did kind of get that full piece, it wouldn't be able to show that kind of logic behind it. So that is the other wrinkle, I guess, to being able to say, can't I just print the whole thing? Anyway, sorry to interrupt with that, Emily. Keep right on going.
Thank you, Keshin. Yes, that's absolutely true. So it uses a branching technology in the system, and if you answer no to a particular question, it will skip you over some of the next few questions that are relevant to the question you've just answered. So that is the reason why you won't be able to see a PDF prior to answering the questions. And then we had one other question that was whether this risk assessment tool is for both nonprofit and public community action agencies. And I believe, yes, it's for all the agencies to use. That's my understanding.
And mine as well. It is, I guess, a little more focused on the nonprofit side, just because that is the area of expertise of both the Community Action Partnership and the Nonprofit Risk Management Center. But we did go through to make sure that those CSBG and community action specific items are built into it. So I'd say it's a better fit for private community action agencies, but it is built with public agencies being able to use it.
Thanks for that clarification. So this last question I got, are you able to select which section you want to work on? So each module is standalone, so you can choose a module and go into that. Some of the modules are a lot longer than others, and once you're within the module, you have to answer each question as you're going through for the reason that Cashin said before, there is a branching technology. But you can choose to do the modules in whichever order you like. And then also at the end, once you've completed all the modules, you can reorganize them so your report also reflects whichever order you prefer to see them in. So the third module of the risk assessment tool is the financial management module, and it's 29 screens. So a lot of these earlier modules are a little bit shorter than some of the later modules, which also may have an effect on your ability to get through it in one sitting, because you may sit down and see that some of the modules are pretty short and feel pretty good about it. And then once you get to some of the longer ones, which are towards the end, you may feel a little burned out and have a harder time getting through it. So this financial management tool, or module rather, has several different topics within it. Obviously, they're all related to financial management, but there's also a little bit here about employee screening, specifically for employees that are going to be handling finances or handling cash at your organization. So some of the questions that you'll see in the financial management specifically ask about screening of people who will be handling money at your organization, and then also how your board handles, or how they play a role in the organization's financial management as well. So in some organizations, the board has to authorize all bank accounts and all check signers, and basically all disbursements and types of things like that will go through the board. In some organizations, that may not be the case. And then there's some very specific questions, so whether your organization has an investment committee, and then whether they approve the sale of all investments. So obviously this may not be relevant to every organization, because not all organizations are going to have the ability to to have investments. So this is an example of a question that may be screened out based on your answers. So some of the necessary documents and knowledge here, mostly it's knowledge, some information about screening, so some HR knowledge, a little bit of knowledge about what type of coverage you have in your crime coverage, which is typically found in your liability insurance, but it may be elsewhere, it may be standalone. So you need to have a little knowledge of insurance to get through this. And then obviously a vast amount of knowledge about the financial management day-to-day in your organization, as well as fundraising and investment. So of course you probably want to have someone who deals with finances on a regular basis going through this module, or someone that understands very well the financial management of the organization. So typically that might be a CFO or some other person, an accountant, somebody who handles your money regularly. And then also, since there are some HR questions, someone who's familiar with the screening and the policies that are applicable to people who handle money is also relevant here. So the fourth module is the Contracts and Procurement module, and this is relevant to most organizations because most organizations will use vendors or have outside contractors who are doing some type of work for their agency. So this module has 31 screens. Some of the general topics include contract language, so specifically asking about provisions in your contracts. So this is very specific information. You may want to have some actual contracts with you. Also the content of your contracts, so what types of things you're contracting about, and then who you're contracting with. So some of the sample questions you might find in this module are whether you're using written contracts to purchase goods and services, whether you've ever been asked to indemnify another party in a contract, and whether you actually use vendors outside your agency. So some of the necessary documents here, like I said, you may want to actually bring in contracts and kind of look over them and see what kinds of information you're doing. So the module specifically asks about contracts with these different types of people: volunteers, vendors, board members, independent contractors, and then employees. It also asks specifically about language in your contracts. So these are legal provisions that are included in many contracts, liability, choice clauses, which is whether there's a provision within the contract that says where the lawsuit may have to be brought or what type of law will apply. And then this force majeure clause is basically when you can get out of a contract. And then, of course, knowledge of the content of current contracts is required here. And then the final question asks about whether you use legal review for contracts. So if you have an internal general counsel, that may be something that you do on a regular basis. But if you're using external legal counsel, maybe you don't use that person for every contract. So this question may be difficult. So who do you want to involve here? If you have someone who's in charge of procurement or contracts, that person will be really useful for this module. It also asks some specific questions about how you deal with your volunteers and what types of contracts you have with them. And then, of course, general counsel, because some of the questions that are asked about are specifically legal language. So general counsel should obviously be a little more familiar with that type of language than anyone else in your organization. Or if you have a board member who's a lawyer or someone else who's familiar with legal terms, especially contracts, then that person would be really useful for this module. So the fifth module, this is one of the longest modules. It's 81 screens long. It includes, obviously, a vast array of human resources topics, and some of the bigger ones are hiring and termination, what policies apply to your employees and volunteers, and your insurance in terms of employment practices liability. So some of the questions you might see are asking about how many locations you have, where you have staff members working, what kinds of policies you have that apply to your staff members, what kinds of screening processes you use before you hire. And then there are also some questions about later in the relationship, once you already have these employees. Do you perform performance reviews And do you use salary increases based on performance or cost of living, or neither? And then obviously there's a couple questions that are very specific to insurance, and specifically one of the questions asks whether your insurance policy provides the specific coverage for administrative complaints. So that's a very specific question. So some of the necessary documents and knowledge, obviously a lot of knowledge and information about the HR process throughout hiring all the way through determination. Those are all really important. There are a few specific questions about IRS regulations and whether your organization is aware of and has found anyone to be a disqualified person under the IRS regulations in terms of contractors. And then you need to have some knowledge about whether the board has this compensation review process. So this is the first module I identified where you may actually want to bring in specific documents that may be really helpful. So the documents that I thought would be especially helpful for this module would be an employee handbook, because there are a lot of specific questions about employee policies in this module. So if you have an employee handbook, and if not, if you have any policies that apply directly to your employees, those would be really useful to have when you're going through this module. The second thing here is an application. So this would be an employment application if you use a written application for your staff members. That would be really useful here because there are specific questions about whether you ask for a release to contact references, whether there's a truth clause. A truth clause is an indication in the application that the person who's applying acknowledges that what they're providing, the information they're providing is all true, and you can verify it, and if it's found to not be true, that can be the reason they don't get the job. So there are some of these really specific legal provisions that are frequently included in applications that are asked about here. The third is an offer letter. So some organizations use these and some don't. If you do use this, you might want to bring it in here. So an offer letter is typically used after someone has been chosen for employment and they're given a little more information specifically about the job. So typically it will tell them whether they're going to be an exempt employee or whether they're going to be non-exempt, whether they're going to be hourly or salaried, and other general information like that. So there are some specific questions in this module that relate to that specifically. So if you have an offer letter, this would be a good place to use it. And then finally, like I said, there's a couple questions at the end about this employment practices liability insurance coverage. So if you have this employment practices liability coverage, now would be a good time to bring that in. So sometimes this is also a standalone policy, but it's also often bundled with your D&O policy. So if you have a board policy, the directors and officers policy, it frequently has this EPL within it. So if you have the EPL standalone, you would want to bring that in. If it's not standalone, you may look in your D&O policy and see if this is also within that. So who to involve in this process, in this module? Definitely HR, because it's the HR module, or any person that specifically deals with hiring and employment throughout the process. And then also your insurance manager, who may have some specific knowledge about the employment practices liability. So the sixth module is really short. It's very brief. It's about communication risk. There are only 5 screens here. And really what it's asking about is your ability to respond to inquiries, both from volunteers and other stakeholders, and also from the media. And it also asks a couple questions about social media and how that's used in your organization. So some of the sample questions are here. Do you have a social media policy? A lot of organizations now have this. Some still don't, but it's becoming more and more common for nonprofits and for organizations generally to have the social media policy. And then how you respond to inquiries from stakeholders, whether it be the media or volunteers. So some necessary documents for this, or really knowledge, is just generally how do you communicate with external stakeholders, so how do you communicate with the media, and also with internal stakeholders, so your volunteers. There's also a couple of questions that aren't directly related to communication. So social media policy, how do you monitor social media and what types of training do you use? And then there is one question that asks about whether you have a policy that regards photographs. So a lot of organizations choose to have a waiver form before they post photographs on either their website or on social media. they have a parent sign it if it's a child, and sometimes they have the participant themselves sign it if it's an adult. So there's a question specifically about that within this module. So if you have a PR person, that person would be the one you probably want to get involved in this module. Since it's very brief, you may have enough knowledge yourself about these few issues that are addressed here. But if you have a communications person or something like that, you may want to bring them in to help you with this module. So the 7th module is service delivery risks. This is also a very brief module. It's only 15 screens. It asks specifically about different programs that you offer. So these are some of the sample questions. As you can see, they all are asking about whether you offer this type of program or not. So this is one module that's branched very, very, very much. So if you say you don't have this service, it will skip over the questions that relate to that service. If you say you do have it, then it will ask you some more specific questions about that. So some necessary documents. If you have a Head Start program, it asks a few specific questions about that, about whether you're complying with the regulations that apply to that specific program. And then generally, if you have any of the other programs, obviously we'll ask if you have them, and then we'll ask a little bit about whether you've thought about some of the risks that arise from those programs. So for this module, it would be really helpful to have somebody who's a program manager or who oversees all the programs at your organization, just someone who's generally familiar. They don't have to have a lot of specific information about the program, but anyone who's familiar with the actual programs themselves would be really helpful with this module. All right, so the 8th module, this is the longest module. It's 88 screens. So this is protecting vulnerable populations. So this is really long because it covers a lot of different topics. One of the biggest topics here is youth protection. It asks about kind of child safety policies, reporting processes, a lot of different things about how you interact with youth as an organization. It also has a lot of questions about safety and how you protect safety of both your clients and your staff and volunteers. And then it also asks specifically about facilities and programs, so specific rules that are in place for particular facilities and particular programs. So some of the sample questions are here, whether you have specific policies to guard the safety in terms of privacy or violence because of possession of weapons. And then it also asks a bit about specific programs that you offer and kind of suggests some particular risks that arise from certain different types of programs. So for this module, you need to know a lot about different policies that apply to different programs and different facilities. You'll also need to have a lot of knowledge about safety and security. So some specific issues that it covers here are gangs, gang violence, whether you're operating in an area that has a lot of gang violence, discipline, how you discipline your clients, whether that's necessary, and what happens when there's staff misconduct, how you deal with that. You'll also need to have a lot of information about your particular programs, especially if you have programs that deal with youth or other at-risk groups. And then finally, of course, you'll have to have information on staff screening. So there are a few questions that ask specifically about how staff are trained and what kind of information is obtained about staff prior to putting them into a particular program. And there are also questions that relate to how you determine what types of services you're going to provide. So documents that I thought would be really helpful in this module were any information you have about topics and trainings that are covered in your orientation process. So a lot of organizations have a very detailed, elaborate type of orientation where they have different trainings and may go on for several weeks. There are several questions in this module that ask specifically whether you cover particular topics. So if you have kind of a consolidated grouping of these topics and trainings that you're doing, this would be a really useful place to bring that in. So who to involve in this module? This is probably the most complicated and the most broad module because it really touches on a lot of areas. So an HR person would be really helpful because it asks a lot specifically about policies and kind of staff screening. It would be really helpful also if you have a youth protection manager, somebody that's in charge of any youth programs you have. That person would be really helpful in this module as well. Then, because there are a lot of questions about safety and security at different facilities and during different programs, if you have someone who is a safety manager or security officer or something like that, that person will have some really useful input as well. Mentoring, there are several specific questions about mentoring. That's an area where we see a lot of risk. So if you have that type of program, someone who's in charge of that will be really useful. And then finally here, the maintenance personnel. There are a lot of questions about facilities and how often inspections are done through your facilities. So if you have a maintenance person who's kind of overseeing these kind of issues, this is a really important place. So for a module like this that's really complex and has a lot of different aspects, most of them are grouped. So you may want to start with an HR person, and then that person may find that they're unable to continue once they get to the youth protection area. They can choose the take a break button at the bottom of the screen, and that will simply pause that module where that person stopped. From there, another person could use our same login information and pick up where that person finished. And that may be what you choose to do in a module like this, where there are so many different topics covered in one area. So the ninth module is transportation. So this is kind of a medium-length module. There are 50 screens here. It's obviously all about transportation, which can be a very vast topic for some organizations. So it asks specifically about policies relating to transportation, as well as whether you have contractors that you use either on a regular basis or for a one-time occasion. And then there's also a few questions at the end about your automobile insurance policy. So some of the sample questions that you'll see in this module include specifically about whether you own, rent, or hire vehicles. And if you do so, how do you screen those drivers? If you have drivers within your organization, how do you monitor their performance? And also, what kinds of maintenance do you do on your vehicles? Do you do inspections? And then at the end, there's a couple questions, like I said, about your automobile insurance program specifically. Some of the necessary documents and knowledge, obviously a lot of knowledge about transportation generally, all the different aspects of it, how you choose transportation workers and whether you actually have them internally or whether you use vendors to provide those services. If you have someone who manages your relationship with those contractors, it asks questions about that. And then your automobile insurance policy. So I thought that the automobile insurance policy itself would be very useful in this module because there are some specific questions about coverage that most people wouldn't know. I don't know it about my own organization's policy, so for this particular module, this is probably one of the most important documents you'll need throughout the entire process because the questions are very specific. So who you want to involve here, obviously if you have a transportation manager, this is probably where they'll really be helpful. If you use procurement or you have a general counsel, that person will know a lot more about the contracts that you have. So if you contract on a regular basis with outside providers for transportation, then you may want to bring in someone who deals with those contracts specifically. And then finally, an insurance manager. If you don't understand your automobile insurance policy, then you may want to have whoever is actually in charge of that program come in and go through this module because there are those specific questions. So we're nearly at the end. This is the 10th module, the final module. So it's 58 screens, so it's another pretty long one. And this one deals with property. So there's a little bit of overlap between this and the vulnerable populations because we were going back to the facility issue. So this module asks specifically about maintenance at facilities and also about unique attributes of your facilities. It also asks about some specific environmental risks, which may include from having an old building or being related to asbestos or something like that. So some of the questions that you'll see here, it will ask whether you're located in a private home or traditional office space. Obviously, some smaller organizations don't own a traditional office space. So this will branch based on what you answer to that. You might get more elaborate questions about your facility. It asks about evacuation plans and emergency plans, and then whether you run any specific programs like a food preparation or a thrift shop at your facilities, and then whether you own a camp. Some of the necessary documents and knowledge that you'll need to have here. You'll need to know a lot about your emergency and evacuation procedures. It asks about that. So if you have a lot of different locations and there are a lot of different kind of procedures and plans, if you have an emergency planner, that person would be really helpful here. There's specific questions about these areas listed here in the second bullet. So if you provide childcare, it asks specific information about the playground you use, whether you have a swimming pool on your grounds of your on your premises. And then it also asks about whether you have a thrift shop. It asks about whether you have dressing rooms in your thrift shop, whether you have security monitoring what's going on in that shop. And then there are also several questions about camps. So you also need to know a lot about environmental hazards, which obviously will vary depending upon what types of facilities and premises you actually use. And there are also some questions about how you handle visitors to your premises, so whether you have people log in and whether they have to log out and whether they have somebody walking them around the premises. So there are a lot of specific questions in this module. So who you might want to involve, obviously if you have a property manager, that person's the number one you would think of, but there are also several questions about maintenance of your facilities, so that person would be helpful here as well. Like I said, there's a lot of questions specifically about if you have a camp, what kinds of things you use, what types of safety processes and procedures you have. Same with playground and daycare. So if you have a safety or security person that's in charge of those types of things, they might be really helpful as well. And then obviously there's a lot of specific programs that are asked about here, so those people may be useful here. If you have one person who knows a lot about programs, that person you might want to bring in here as well. All right, so we're done with the modules. Now there's a few general tips that I wanted to just remind you of. So first of all, a summary. So these are some of the documents that I thought would be really helpful. I pointed these out as we went through, but particularly in modules 5, 8, and 9, there are certain documents that would be really useful. So in addition to what's listed here, I also mentioned in the second module, governance, that board minutes would be useful. And I want to reiterate that now since it's not on this slide. So that's for module 2, and that's board minutes, because there are some specific questions asked about what types of information is kept during board meetings. But otherwise, in some of the earlier modules, the questions are kind of general. They don't ask you to specifically look at a document and identify whether certain things are included within that document. So all of these things I talked about before, but as I said, there are these 6 really important documents that you'll probably want to have as you're going through this. And they're in modules 5, 8, and 9. So who to involve? Obviously, as we went through this, I talked about a lot of different types of people with a lot of different types of knowledge. So generally, most organizations will probably want to build a small and agile team. Maybe one person will have all this knowledge and they'll be able to go through this, but more often than not, it'll probably be a couple different people, at least 2 or 3, in order to get as much of this knowledge as you have. So these are the primary areas that are covered throughout this entire risk assessment. So first, obviously, is the board's operation and their role in the organization. So that's their role in finances, their role in operations, their role in screening and hiring people. So this is very broad. Someone with a lot of knowledge about the board is definitely going to be necessary to complete this risk assessment. The second area is the financial management. So there are a lot of questions, mostly in the financial management module, but throughout, specifically about how you handle your finances on a regular basis. And then third, this contracting relationships. There are a lot of questions specifically about the contracts that you have and how you deal with outside vendors. So somebody with a lot of knowledge in that area will be useful. HR and employment. This will include everything you can think of within HR, which it will be policies, hiring of employees, managing volunteers. All of these things are covered. So someone with a lot of HR knowledge will be really useful throughout this process. The next one is the programs and the client served. So someone who really works on a day-to-day basis either overseeing the programs or actually on the ground working in these programs. There's a lot of specific questions about what you offer and what kinds of things are going on within those programs. And then finally, transportation and facilities. So you'll want to have someone who knows a lot about how long it's going to, or about all the different facilities you have. So if you have a lot of different facilities, it might be a much more complex report. So I see several questions about how long it's going to take to complete the process. So obviously that depends a lot on how many people you involve. The more people you involve in the process, the longer it's probably going to take, which is why at the beginning I said you probably want to have one person who's in charge, and that person can schedule everyone else and make sure that things are done as quickly as they possibly can. Generally, the earlier modules that are shorter, they're around 20 screens. They don't take a whole lot of time to get through. Some of the later modules are much more complex and ask much more specific questions, so they may take quite a bit longer. The time, it varies a lot. Probably when I was going through this process, not having specific information, obviously I was just going through the questions to look at them. It probably took me, I would say, probably about 3 hours. So I would guess it would probably take most people at least a good day if they needed to collect information. But obviously if you prepare before you go into the actual risk assessment, you have all the information you need there with you, you may be able to get through it in a much shorter period of time. So I have another question specifically about the transportation module. It relates to all kinds of things. So since it's its own module, you can imagine that it's much more broad than just asking about where you're taking different clients or different programs. It asks a lot of specific questions about how you're screening your drivers. It's not so much just about where you're transporting people, but also about how you're screening those drivers, how you're following up with those drivers, how you're monitoring their performance, and how you're giving them feedback. So it's very, very broad. All right. Okay, so the first tip I have is seek knowledge. So I know I've repeated this several times throughout this presentation, but it's really important. If you have one person in your organization and you know that person has knowledge in a lot of these areas, that's the person you want to go to. Since this is such a complicated process and there's so much to it, you want to make sure you're getting all the knowledge you can. So the more you can bring in people that actually know these things, the better off you'll be. That person may be able to identify things that someone who's newer to the organization or simply doesn't have their hand in as many different areas just can't see. So more perspective, the better. Second, persevere. So this is a really long risk assessment, but once you get to the end, you get this comprehensive report, and you'll feel really good about what you've done, and you'll have this report that kind of helps you go through the different risks you've identified and kind of analyze them more. So even if you get stuck on a question, like I said before, you have to answer the questions in the order they come to you as you're going through the process. You can always take a break and come back to it later, but obviously you don't want to do that too much. So if it's one question you really don't know the answer to, or you're having just a difficult time struggling with that question, you can just choose an answer for that and keep going through the process. Then you can make a note of it and go back to that if you need to later on, if you find that there was some information you were missing or you really found a different answer than you originally thought. But as best you can, answer the questions as you're going through it. So the third tip, ask for help. Like I said, you want to involve people that have a lot of knowledge. If there's something you don't know the answer to, ask a colleague that is working in that particular area. And then, of course, the Nonprofit Risk Management Center is always a resource. You guys can always email us or call us if you have any problems with the system itself, or if you have any specific questions about one of the questions or having difficulty understanding what something actually means, you can always reach out to us as well. And then the fourth tip, and this is kind of a broad tip, so assess yourself. So after you're done with the risk assessment, you get this really comprehensive report. It might be 50 or 100 pages long. Once you get that, you might feel like you're done, but you really want to look at that report and kind of understand the things that you've identified as you went through the assessment. And this can really help guide your organization to determine what types of programs are really good offerings and what kinds of programs are like exposing your organization to risks that you might not have understood. So this can help you make a path to the future and kind of make decisions about what you want to do later on. So we have a question about how agencies that regularly do risk assessments think it benefits them. So this is a really good question, and it's a question we deal with a lot at the center because we frequently help organizations go through risk assessments. So this risk assessment process is you're walking yourself through it. Sometimes what we do at the center is we actually go out and help hold their hands as they're going through the process. And a lot of organizations like to do this on a pretty regular basis. So obviously you guys do it basically every year. Some organizations choose to do it every few years. And a lot of organizations do it because it gives them a chance to kind of take a step back from their day-to-day work and kind of look at the organization from a different view than they might normally see. So it kind of helps you look at all the different areas of your organization and kind of see where things are going well, where they're maybe not going so well, and whether you're really following the risk management practices that you have in place. In terms of best practices, well, this risk assessment really walks you through some of the important things, but at the end of it, you'll still want to look back at what you've done, kind of analyze what you've identified. So the risk assessment has to be thought of as kind of a first step in the bigger risk management picture. So this is just one tool that you can use to kind of help you identify different areas that you may not have been aware of. But from there, you'll also have to make decisions about whether you want to continue down the path you're on or whether you want to change what you're doing now and kind of do something differently or plan for some potential future risks that may happen. So once you're done with the entire risk assessment, you can come back to it and you can print out your report at the end. So this is really important because the report will give you more than just your answer. It will give you advice based on what you answered. So part of the point of going through this process is to get some strategies and tips for things that you've identified that are things that are going on in your organization. So once you finish the entire process, you'll be able to print out the report and it will have the answers that you provided as well as some information, specifically strategies and tips about what you've answered and how that might expose your organization to specific risks. All right, so another question we just received is whether there's a cost for this. So the risk assessment is a tool that was created for CAP. So CAP owns this risk assessment tool. So there is no cost for completing it if you're a community action agency. It's part of your organization's resources provided through CAP. All right. So I just wanted to mention a few other resources that we have at the Nonprofit Risk Management Center. So we have two recently published books. The first is Staff Screening Notebook, which walks through some of the different steps in a good screening process that can be used for either employees or volunteers. And then the other book is this Exposed book that we published last year that there are chapters on governance in there. There's a chapter on employment, so it talks about some of the specific risks that are present for different nonprofits. So it's a really useful tool for a lot of organizations. And then on our website, you can find tons of articles about these different topics. We write a lot about governance and a lot about HR and employment. So if you want to go on our website and look for stuff there, of course, this is free. You can access it on our website. So that's the end of the presentation. If you guys have any more questions, please feel free to type them into the question box there at the bottom of the screen, and I'll try to answer them as best I can.
Hello, everyone. There are several questions that are still kind of coming into the queue, but I want to take a moment to answer some general things that I've seen kind of coming across. To build on the fact that this is a free tool, that is why we do suggest that you go through the Community Action Partnerships website to actually log in. because that kind of takes that first layer of getting to the tool taken care of automatically. So what will happen is if you go to the partnership's website, you can find this under either resources or national training centers in both locations, cross-posted. Look for the Nonprofit Risk Management Center logo, and then click on that. That will take you to our specific affiliate page. So you'll be able to get discounts on like those resources that we just showed up there, as well as the very specific tool that was built for community action. So from there, then you do create a login of your own. It is free, but you do need to create that login so that you can save all of these answers to kind of come back to be able to generate that report, and to be able to add other users into your report. So we've had a couple of questions that were kind of around that vein about how to get to it, costs, that kind of thing. Another general piece here is on the organizational standards. Do you want me to do that, or would you like to jump in, Charles?
Sure. So the quick question was, is this particular tool aligned with the organizational standards? And going through this risk assessment process should meet the organizational standard that requires all community action agencies to do a comprehensive risk assessment. I think it's important to point out two things. The first is that when you get that report at the end, you'll definitely want to keep a copy, because that's most likely what you would submit to your state CSBG lead office to show that you actually went through that process and have completed the comprehensive risk assessment. The second thing to point out is I know that the tool is fairly long and involved. And again, as Emily said, if you're not always sure about a question, go ahead and put down your first or best answer, because you'll still get credit for the standard as long as you've gone through that whole process. So as long as you've completed it, even if there's some questions you have, some things you need to come back to, you would still have gone through that process, and that should satisfy the organizational standard. And again, that's one of the reasons why we wanted to have this second follow-up webinar on the 13th, that as agencies go through and have questions about the questions on the toolkit, we can get those answered on the 13th, whether it's how to respond to questions, what to do if a report comes back that you need to address a particular issue. So again, make sure you keep the report that you get when you finish the risk assessment, and also make sure you just simply go through the risk assessment. Even if you can't answer all the questions, you can always come back and address those, but that will still satisfy the standard of having completed a comprehensive risk assessment.
And I wanted to add just a couple little nuances to that. If you're looking at just kind of the letter of the standard, you would not necessarily have to give your full report over. You could do a summary report or show where management team and the board, because it does say reported to the governing board, where that is in the minutes or in the packet. Board packets on that, because understand that depending on some of your findings out of the risk assessment, you may not be comfortable sharing that until you've had a chance to address. So while that would kind of be the gold standard, you could still get through the organizational standard, the compliance, with a summary report or through minutes showing the discussion. And one other piece on the standards, a couple of people have asked how it relates to assessing the organizational standards as a whole, or whether this is kind of a duplicative endeavor. And I would say no, it is not a duplicative endeavor, because the organizational standards are kind of the big picture view, whereas this is going to actually dig into your specific programs, policies, facilities, stuff that we would never have been able to really work on, and nor did we want to get to that level of detail in the organizational standards, because there's just so much variation between community action agencies. So this is one particular standard. Yes, there are a couple of things that might show up more than once. For example, some of the HR policies, it is not actually a duplicative piece. All right, sorry, Emily, we took up a fair amount of time, but hopefully you've had time to kind of process some of the other questions and chats that have come in.
Yeah, definitely, thanks. So there are a couple questions that I wanted to address. The first is, when should you complete this risk assessment by? So we're having the follow-up webinar to address questions that you have about issues that come up while you're going through the process, and that's going to be on August 13th. So if you would go through the process prior to that time, then you can send your questions in to CAP, and we can address those during the next webinar. So it's on August 13th. Then another question, can more than one person log on to the assessment at one time? So if you want to have multiple people working on the same risk assessment, the way you would probably want to do that is to set up one account and then kind of make sure people are going into it at different times into that same account, so that you end up with one complete report, although it may be several people that have contributed to that. So you probably don't want to log in at the same time. I don't think that you would be able to complete the report that way. So it would have to be consecutive. Again, if you guys have any specific questions or if I accidentally missed one, feel free to email me. My email is on the screen here. You can always email me or call the Nonprofit Risk Management Center if you have any questions about this presentation or about the tool generally. Feel free to reach out to me.
All right, and I'll put this in the chat window as well so that you can physically see it. But again, to get to the risk assessment, it is best to go through the Community Action Partnership's website, www.communityactionpartnership.com. And then you can find it under both the National Training Center button or under the Resource button. It is one of the online tools, so if you want to navigate straight to that. So that way you can get to our specific affiliate page. Let's see, other questions that have come in.
Oh yeah, I see. So I can answer this one. You don't have to complete the modules in order. Once you go into a module, you have to complete that module in full, although you can stop and take a break from it. But you can complete the modules in any order you'd like.
Great, thanks. We will continue to kind of keep the line open for a few moments, but I did want to remind everybody that though it's not required, we would suggest that you attend the second webinar on August the 13th. And preferably you would have gotten a start at least on your risk assessment so that you can, in fact, bring your questions about either some of the recommendations or follow-up steps or any issues that you encountered in starting this process. So we are going to open up a email address that is ttaSupport@communityactionpartnership.com. I'll also put that into the chat window so that you can see it, and I'll send it out in a follow-up email once we get the recording and the slides up as well. So you can forward your questions as they come up to that email address. That way we can get them to Emily, and she can prepare to make sure that the 13th is truly responsive to what you guys have already experienced. And we are communityactionpartnership.com. I saw somebody was asking again about our website. We are a .com on that. So with that, I look forward to seeing those questions coming into ttaSupport@communityactionpartnership.com. And there will be a evaluation that will pop up at the end of this webinar, so appreciate your participation in that. That way we can also make sure that we are being responsive to what it is that you need and experience. So with that, I'm going to hand it over to Jarl for any last minute thoughts, and then over to Emily for the same thing.
Great, and thank you all again for signing on with us. And as Cashin said, it would be extremely helpful for us if you send your comments to that address, just so we can compile them, and again make sure that we have a clear agenda for the 13th. Although we're also more than happy to just simply open it up for questions that you have on the 13th as well. It just helps us put the agenda together if you email us your questions beforehand, so we can see which issues are rising to the top. But again, thank you so much for joining us this afternoon. If you have any other suggestions for technical assistance around the risk assessment or around the organizational standards, by all means feel more than free to reach out to Cashin and I directly. Thanks again. And Emily, any last concluding words?
No, I don't think so. Thank you, everyone, and I look forward to seeing you guys all again on August 13th.
Thank you, everyone.